time to waste. So much to cover today. We're doing a double daf. That's Eitan Katz from his album Unplugged #3. The song's of Shlomo Carlebach. The song is called Ufduye. Who is with us on a Monday evening? Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, Jerry in El Paso, Yaakov in the California Valley Desert, Guy in Ohio, Stephen in New Hampshire, Renee in Indiana, Debbie in New Jersey, Jerry's in Texas, Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Sandy in Michigan, David in South Bend, Yehuda in South Carolina, Cesar in Quito, Ecuador. Wow, well, Quito, Peru. Oh, wow, I'm really embarrassed that I'm not sure. You'll let me know. Quito's in Peru, right? I should know. I left South America. I was born in Chile, but I left when I was 5. I apologize. My geography's terrible, and I ought to know. I'm embarrassed. Okay, over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas, Marjorie in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you with us. All right, we're covering 2 pages today. This is Dafs, 46 and 47 here in Chapter 4 of Tractate Kesubos, the laws of marriage contracts. We're in Chapter 4, completing our discussion of Mishnah number 3, and we'll open Mishnah number 4 during today's journey with God's help. Okay, so generally speaking, the laws of marriage contracts, but as we've seen, the sages are spending quite a bit of time sort of defining who's entitled to which contract. Does a woman enter the marriage as a virgin or a non-virgin? Was she rendered a non-virgin against her will? Therefore, what would be the punishment of the rapist or of the seducer? And here in Chapter 4, we're starting to transition toward the actual, privileges and obligations of being in a marriage. But transition is sort of the operative term, because in the ancient world, such a patriarchal society, women did really very, very rare for a woman to have some kind of financial independence. So the usual journey of a woman was to pass from her father's house to her husband's house. And therefore, since what's interesting here is how careful the Torah and the sages were to light up the darkness. Nina came to remind me. How careful the sages were to define who is responsible for her, right? And in what way is her sustainer, her caretaker, responsible for her? Is it her father? Is it her husband? And what about these kind of in-between stages that happen since in ancient times there was this period of betrothal, where she was considered married to her betrothed, right? The husband to be. They're not fully married yet, but if she were to have if she were to have sex with some other man while she's betrothed, that is adultery. If they want to break off the betrothal, she needs a bill of divorce, and yet she's still living in her father's house. And so who bears financial responsibility for her? Who is entitled to her earnings or the profit from things that she finds while living in her father's house, and that is impossible to return to the one who lost it because there's no identifying marks, etc. So the extreme care that's being taken here to define these laws, on the one hand, to the modern ear, it's like, well, this is crazy. I mean, how could a woman have so little power over her own purse, as it were? But in the ancient world, where already she had so little power over her own purse, they were being so careful to define, maybe she has little power over her own purse, but somebody is responsible that this woman is taken care of in the world. And who is it exactly? And what are her claims either against her father or her husband? And recall, this is a legal structure. It certainly doesn't mean, that women didn't have actual social power, right? There was a legal system that her rights and I'm sort of reminded of that comedy not so long ago, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right, where the Greek mom says, but the woman is the neck, and she turns the head so far away from the truth. Pick this up 40. Okay, so we're talking about at the end of the wedding. It was amazing, so much simcha. We should all. That is the. I'm just seeing a little bit of freezing in my mind. Comments, can you hear me clearly? Getting messages from that is so annoying. And this is like a different kind of interruption than I've seen before. To start over, although that's such a hassle. But I think that listening to this will be even a bigger hassle. Okay, I'm going to stop the broadcast. I'm going to start over. Hopefully that will take care of the glitching. All right, we appear to be live on the restart. Hopefully it's not going to be glitchy like it was a moment ago. I didn't really do anything different. Just restarted all devices, which I did the first time. But anyway, seems to be working. So let me just give folks a couple of seconds to catch up while I refresh my computer screen. All right, seems to be working on Facebook. And we seem to be live and never left on YouTube. Okay. All right. People are finding it. Very good. I hate being dependent on these electronics, but I suppose it teaches us patience and acceptance. Oh Lord, let me change the things I cannot tolerate and tolerate the things I cannot change, right? Okay. Here we go. Right, so as I mentioned before, this is a restart. So I introduced already in part 1 on the Facebook broadcast that we are in chapter 4 of Tractate Kesubos. We're doing pages 46 and 47 today. We're defining the rights and obligations in marriage of the spouses, but we're really tracking the journey of the bride from her father's house to her husband's house, and being very, very specific about what are her rights and obligations. And because it was a very patriarchal society where there were very few independent women, so the sages were extremely careful to decide, who is responsible for her upkeep, and then what laws flow from that. What are the consequences of those laws? Okay, so we pick this up on 46a, a few paragraphs down. So the Gemara is discussing the laws of the Defamer, right? So this was a case where a man, becomes betrothed to a young woman who he expects to come into the marriage as a virgin, and then they get married and they have their wedding night. And then afterward, he claims he was expecting her to be a virgin, and he found that she was not a virgin. Now, if it's true that she's not a virgin, then either she became a non-virgin before they were betrothed, in which case he was misled that he was marrying a virgin when he wasn't, and there's just a financial difference to her ketubah there and maybe something else. Or if he betrothed a virgin and then she committed adultery while they were already betrothed, then if there were witnesses and she was warned, etc., she would be liable to the death penalty. So it's a very, very, very extreme consequence. If it's false, if he is saying this because he decides, I don't want to marry her, and I'll just get out of it by accusing her of being a non-virgin, and it turns out that he was lying, now you would think he would be subject to the death penalty because his claim would subject her to the death penalty. except that it's not just because of his claim that she would receive the death penalty. There would be more to it than that. But in any case, the Torah specifies that in this case, he's going to have to pay a fine to her father. His marriage is going to go forward, and he will forever lose the right to divorce her, which was a unilateral right of the husband in that patriarchal system. He loses that right, and for the rest of both their lives, he must support her no matter what. He will not have a choice in that matter. That's the law of the defamer. Okay, so the Gemara is discussing laws associated with the law of the defamer. So the sages taught the following baraisa based upon the following verses. Deuteronomy 22, 18 through 19. And the elders of that city shall take the man and chastise him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the father of the young woman. So this law is only relevant to a woman who's in the stage of being a young woman. Not a minor, not a grown woman, but that in-between stage when she's a young woman. That's just the way the Torah defines it. Quote, and they shall fine him. Ve'anshu is the word for fine. And this is referring to money. And chastise him, this is referring to flogging, right? So if he defames her, the other part of his punishment is whipping, right? He's going to get whipped. He's going to get lashes. He's going to get them publicly. So the Gemara asks, and remember, this is a society without prison. So really, it's death penalty, lashes, or money penalties, right? That's basically how things are dealt with. There's some others, but that's mostly what we see. So lashes, very big penalty, very big deal. The Gemara asks, granted, with regard to the phrase, and they fine him, ve'anshu, although the word ve'anshu can refer to any punishment, in this case, it is referring to money, as it is written, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give them to the father of the young woman. However, with regard to the statement of the Baraisa that the verb chastise him, that this is referring to flogging, that he receives lashes, from where do we derive this? And Rabbi Abahu said, we learn the meaning of the word, and I'm trying to go fast because we're trying to do a double daf today, and we had a delay getting started, which I apologize for. Rabbi Abahu said, we learn the meaning of this word chastise in the case of the defamer by verbal analogy from the word chastise stated in the verse, if a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, that will not listen to the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they chastise him, will not listen to them. And this is the one who is taken out to the gates of the city and executed, right? So this is never happened in the history of the Jewish people because this law was so difficult to enforce. It's one of those cases, well, it's not a hypothetical law, it's a real law in the Torah, but it's so problematic that the sages basically, said, well, what are the elements of this death penalty in order to enforce it? And it's just too high a barrier to ever have actually happened, right? The wanton, gluttonous, rebellious son. It's almost like a kid. It's not just that, he drinks too much, he eats too much, he yells at people, he's rude. It's much, much, much beyond that. It's somebody who's destined, for a life of sin and who's going to be dangerous to the community. It's almost like if you somehow had an inkling, that one of these, murderers who ends up shooting up a school, right? That, like, imagine if the parents knew that he was on that track. And even today, it happens sometimes that parents, have such a problematic child that they will report him to the authorities. God forbid it should happen to, any family. But imagine if you had the inkling that your child was that dangerous, right? And in ancient times, imprisonment was generally not an option. So then the Torah would say, well, that's somebody you have to remove from the community, and you would actually execute him. But practically speaking, the sages set the bar for administering that death penalty so high that it never happened. Right? It just never happened. We learn that elsewhere in the Talmud. We learn that elsewhere. For the purposes of our discussion here, they're using that law to pull some definitions out of it. In this case, the word chastise. What does chastise mean? Does it mean flog? How do we know that? And the implication of the word in that law, in that verse, Deuteronomy 22:18, and the implication of the word chastise in that verse is derived from the word son that appears in the same verse. And the implication of the word son, like as the son of this man and woman, with regard to a rebellious son, is derived from the word bin in the verse, then it shall be if the wicked man deserve being to be flogged. So they're making this link. And so the Gemara asks, from where do we derive the warning, i.e. the prohibition that serves as the source for the flogging of the defamer? I just note in passing that it could have said the rebellious child. And I think specifically, they can't even imagine a case where a woman would be, a female child would be so dangerous that it needs to, that she needs to be executed by her parents. It never happened in the history of the Jewish people, but even to imagine it, it would only be with a male child, not with a female child. It's kind of interesting. At any rate, the Gemara asks, from where do we derive the warning, i.e. the prohibition that serves as the source for the flogging of a defamer, this one who defames his wife falsely? Rabbi Lazar says that the prohibition is derived from the verse, you shall not go up and down as a talebearer, Leviticus 19:16. Rabbi Nussin says that it is derived from, then you shall keep yourself from every evil thing, davar ra, every evil thing, which is expounded to mean dibur ra, from evil speech, right? So what they're saying is, the Torah, has two different verses. One is, you shall not be a talebearer or gossip monger. And the other is, you shall keep yourself away from every evil thing, which can also be translated as, you shall keep yourself away from evil speech. And in both cases, if you slander someone, for example, like your wife, the punishment for that is lashes. So the Gemara asks, and what is the reason that Rabbi Lazar did not state that it is derived from this verse quoted by Rabbi Nussin? And the Gemara answers, he requires that verse for the statement of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. As it was taught, then you shall keep yourself from every evil thing. And instead of translating this as, stay away from evil speech and therefore you get flogged if you engage in such a thing, instead, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said, a person should not think impure thoughts by day and thereby come by night to the impurity of an emission. In other words, one whose mind is in a sexual gutter all day long will come to have a seminal emission at night, which would render him ritually impure. And before he could enter the temple, he'd have to go through the purification process, of immersing in a mikveh and whatever else is necessary, because you're rendered impure by that. So the Gemara asks, and what is the reason that and the Gemara asks the reverse question. Well, then what is the reason that Rabbi Nussin did not state that it is derived from that verse of Rabbi Lazar? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Nussin explains that verse, which includes the term talebearer, right, that you might have thought that the source for, that one who defames his wife is going to be subject to lashes should be taken from don't be a talebearer, don't be a gossip monger. But Rabbi Nussin explains that verse, which includes the term talebearer, rakil, as a warning to the court that it should not be soft, rachla, this litigant, and harsh to that one, that it must treat both sides as equals, kind of using a little bit of the syntax and punning almost on the language. So the Gemara cites another statement that deals with a defamer. If the husband did not say to witnesses, come and testify for me that my wife committed adultery, but they testify for him of their own accord, and they are subsequently discovered to be liars, well, in that case, the husband is not flogged, and he does not give the 100 selah, as he did not intentionally harm her. These other witnesses came and said and falsely accused her of being a non-virgin, having committed adultery. So she and her conspiring witnesses are brought early to the place of stoning to receive the death penalty. And the Gemara asks, does it enter your mind to say that she and her conspiring witnesses are stoned? If she is liable to be stoned, then they are not conspiring witnesses. And conversely, if they are conspiring witnesses, they are stoned and she is exempt. Rather, this must mean either she or her conspiring witnesses are brought early to the place of stoning. If they were telling the truth, she is stoned. And if they conspired and offered false testimony, they are liable to be stoned. The Gemara infers from the Brisa that the reason the husband is not flogged or fined is that the husband did not tell these false witnesses to come and lie in court. But if he did tell them to testify, they're acting as his agents in acting as conspiring witnesses, false witnesses. Although he did not hire them, but he merely persuaded them to testify that his wife had committed adultery as a betrothed woman, as he's part of the conspiracy, as it were, then he is flogged and he must pay the fine. And this serves to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, The husband is liable to the punishments of a defamer only if he hired witnesses. The Gemara asks, what is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Nowhere does the Torah explicitly state that the husband hired false witnesses. Why is he demanding that only in that case is he sort of included in the conspiracy if he actually paid them money? And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Bahu said it is derived by a verbal analogy between the term placing, written with regard to a defamer, and the term placing, written with regard to the prohibition against charging interest. Right? A Jew cannot lend to another Jew and charge interest for the loan. And it is written here with regard to a defamer, and he placed wanton charges against her, Deuteronomy 22:14. And it is written there, neither shall you place upon him interest, Exodus 22:24. So just as below with regard to interest, the verse is referring to money, so too here in the case of the defamer, it is referring to money, thereby indicating that the husband paid money in order to substantiate his false accusation, which in a way is interesting. I mean, if he's paying witnesses to bring false testimony, or if he's just persuading them, and somehow they are willing to do it because they like him or they're going to earn, his favor, as it were. What difference does it make? They're all three of them, the husband who's a liar and the conspiring witnesses who are liars, are in a conspiracy. And that's the majority opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says the law seems to say that it's only going to count that he's really responsible for this if he paid money for those witnesses to come. But that's the minority opinion. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, Rav Yosef Tzidoni likewise taught in the school of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. It is derived from the verbal analogy between the term placing, written with regard to a defamer, and the term placing, written with regard to the prohibition of charging interest. Rabbi Yirmiyah raised a dilemma. According to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, if the husband hired the false witnesses with land instead of money, what is the law? If he hired them with less than the value of a peruta, what is the law? If he hired both witnesses with a peruta, just a very small amount of money, like an unsubstantial amount of money, is it the same as just convincing them? Are we going to change the outcome? Since this law is derived from the case of interest, perhaps like the prohibition against charging interest, it applies only with regard to money rather than if you make the payment with land, and only with money that is greater than the de minimis amount of a peruta, which is like a penny. So similarly, Rav Ashi raised a dilemma concerning a defamer. If he defamed his wife with regard to their first marriage, what is the law? In other words, if a man married a woman, divorced her, remarried her, and subsequently defamed her by claiming that she had committed adultery during the period of betrothal before their first marriage, what is the law? And similarly, if he performed levirate marriage, right, he's just stepping in as the brother after his brother, who was married to her, died childless, and now he comes in as the law of, he's like the Yavama, as we learned in Tractate Yavamos, to perform levirate marriage. Is it the same outcome? And the Gemara comments, well, resolve at least one of these dilemmas, as Rabbi Yonah taught, that the verse, and the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man, and it serves to emphasize I gave her to this man and not to the Yavam, right, his surviving brother. So consequently, if one defames his Yavama with regard to her original marriage to his brother, the unique laws of defamation do not apply because it just doesn't satisfy the elements of the law stated in the Torah. In the course of the previous discussion, the Gemara mentioned a dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Gemara asks, what is the opinion of the rabbis and what is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, referred to above, as it is taught in a Baraisa? How does the case of defamation proceed? If we're going to have a case for defamation, how does it work? Right? This man betrothed a young woman, and then it's time for them to get married. She comes into his house, they have their wedding night, they sleep together for the first time, and the next day he claims that the girl he expected to be a virgin was not a virgin, and if true, and it's proven, and there's witnesses, etc., she could be liable to the death penalty. If he's a liar, he's going to have a very severe penalty also. But how does this case actually get brought, if it's going to be brought? So, how does this case proceed? It involves a situation where the husband came to the court and he said to the father of the young woman, so-and-so, the father, I have not found indications of your daughter's virginity. If there are witnesses who testify that she committed adultery under his authority, meaning while she was betrothed to me, then she has a marriage contract of 100 dinars, which is the marriage contract, the ketubah, of a non-virgin, as opposed to the marriage contract of 200 dinars, which is the marriage contract of a virgin. Now the Gemara immediately interrupts the citation of this baraisa and says, wait a minute. If there are witnesses who testify that she committed adultery under his authority, meaning while she was betrothed, does she have a marriage contract of 100 dinars? She's liable to the death penalty. If there were witnesses who come and testify, then she's liable to the death penalty. So the Gemara explains that this is what the Tana said. If there are witnesses who testify that she committed adultery under his authority, she is liable to receive the punishment for stoning. However, if she engaged in licentious sexual relations at the outset, before her betrothal, when she was still a single woman, then she is merely guilty of deceiving her husband with regard to the status that she entered the betrothal. She said she was a virgin when she wasn't, and therefore she has a marriage contract of 100 dinars rather than 200 dinars. The Gemara resumes the quotation of the Baraisa, how this case comes, actually moves forward. So if it was discovered that the bad name is not a bad name, meaning the husband's accusation was false, so he is the liar, and he's defaming her, then he is flogged, and he gives her father 100 sela, whether he had intercourse with her or whether he had not had intercourse with her. That's the majority opinion. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says these matters were stated only in a case where he had intercourse with his wife before defaming her. Right? So when is he saying, I found my wife not to be a virgin? Presumably after their wedding night, right? Before then, how does he know whether she's a virgin or not? It's on their wedding night. They go to have marital relations, and he discovers that her hymen is not intact. And he says, this woman is not a virgin, right? But interestingly, so one side of this debate says that's the only time when he could bring that accusation. How could he bring the accusation before they consummate the union? Where's he coming from saying she's not a virgin if he hasn't actually had sex with her, which is the time when he would discover that? But that's actually the majority opinion, that he can bring that accusation even before they have sex. So how do we get this? So these matters are stated only in a case where he had intercourse with his wife before defaming her. And the Gemara asks, granted, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this is as it is written. If a man take a wife and he go in unto her, and when I came near to her, he says, I did not find in her the tokens of virginity, as both expressions refer to sexual intercourse. He went in to have sex with his new wife. He discovered that she's not a virgin, that she had had sex before, and that's why he's bringing the case to court. Or if he's a liar, she was a virgin, but now that he has had sex with her, rendering her not a virgin, right? She's never going to be a virgin again if he had sex with her, but he's saying that already happened before. How can anyone prove otherwise? Very difficult. That's why this case is so emotionally fraught. Now, but according to the opinion of the rabbis, what is the meaning of the phrases, and go in unto her, and when I came near to her? Right? Meaning, according to the rabbis, if this guy defames her and says she was not a virgin, and he says that without having had sex with her, then he is still liable as a liar and a defamer. He can still be found liable for defaming her. You might say, well, he didn't have sex with her, but he just kind of looked, right? And so that could be a valid way for him to truthfully say that he found her not a virgin, but it's also a valid way for him to be found liable of being a liar and having to have the penalty of the liar, of the defamer. So the Gemara says, granted, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this is as it is written, I did not find in your daughter the tokens of virginity, as Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov claims that the husband had relations with her, and then he discovered that she was not a virgin. However, according to the opinion of the majority, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, what is the meaning of, I did not find in your daughter the tokens of virginity, if they did not have intercourse? And the Gemara answers, the rabbis explain, this means, I did not find I did not find for your daughter the fitness of virginity. In other words, I had discovered that she was unfaithful without having had sex with her. So the Gemara asks further, well, granted, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this is as it is written, that as the Torah states, that the father replies, and these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity. The father brings proof that his daughter was a virgin. And what does that mean? So this is that idea that they have a wedding night, and if her hymen was intact, there's going to be some blood that comes from that union, and we know that there's exceptions to this, and the Talmud has stated that. But that the general case would be that there would be some blood from the rupturing of the hymen. It would get on the sheet, and in the morning, this is crazy, the girl would take that sheet, right, hold it as a protection for her in case her husband turned out to be a defamer. And then if he brought that case, she would give the sheet to her father, and her father would go to the court and say, here's the signs of her virginity. This guy's a liar. Right? So that would be the father's claim. However, according to the opinion of the rabbis, where this guy could bring the claim that she's not a virgin and become liable as a defamer, even if he never had sex with his wife, well, what would the evidence of the fact that she was a virgin, what evidence would there be? Since they never had sex for this to happen. So according to the opinion of the rabbis, what is the meaning of, and these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity? And the rabbis answer that what the father means by these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity is these are the proofs of the fitness of my daughter's virginity. In other words, he either brings witnesses to counter the testimony of the husband's witnesses, or he provides some other proof that his daughter was a virgin at the time of her marriage. I mean, if the husband is bringing witnesses that this girl was not a virgin, so somehow there were two witnesses who are going to say, we saw this woman have sex with some other man while she was betrothed, or before she was betrothed, right? And then the father could bring witnesses who say, well, those two witnesses are liars, right? Or some other kind of testimony like that. And it doesn't necessarily depend on this physical evidence from the bed. So the Gemara poses yet another question along the same lines. Granted, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, this is as it is written, and they shall spread the garment. And the father brings a sheet on which the couple had intercourse and shows it is stained with blood. However, according to the opinion of the rabbis who claim that a husband can defame his wife even if they have not engaged in intercourse, what is the meaning of the phrase, and they shall spread the garment? And Rabbi Abahu said that the rabbis interpret this expression as follows: they shall spread means they will examine. That which he placed against her, samla. In other words, not that they will examine the bedding of the couple, but that they will examine, the judges of the court will examine the situation. Is this guy coming to us and claiming that his new wife is not a virgin? Is he legit or is he a liar? And they're going to start asking and bringing other witnesses. What kind of person is he? How did this case come about? This is such a rare occurrence that such a young girl somehow is not a virgin. Where is he coming from? They're going to do a thorough investigation. And the sort of metaphorically, they're calling that examining the garment or examining the laundry, as it were. And really, it would be much better for everybody if this, was not happening. It's unpleasant for everybody. And again, no incidents are being brought here. This is very much in that hypothetical realm, what they would have to do if the case was brought. But I think we can rest assured that this was rarely brought. Rabbi Bahu said, that the rabbis interpret this expression as follows: they shall spread, they shall examine that which was placed against her. In other words, they cross-examine the witnesses who have testified against her. As there's taught in Baraisen, they shall spread the garment. This teaches that the witnesses of this husband come forward, and likewise the witnesses of the father come forward, and the court clarifies the matter like a new garment. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, the matters are as they are written. The verse refers to an actual cloth, and he is the minority, right? This is actually one of the cases where the rabbis are saying the Torah here had to be speaking metaphorically, right? Because, they're going to bring the proofs, but if the law is that, the case of the defamer can go forward even if they haven't had sex, because he can bring that claim about her, but then there's no way to prove her innocence, it must mean that examine the garment is a metaphor for examining the situation and cleaning the situation the same way you would clean a garment in the laundry. Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Yaakov says, Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Rav Yaakov Bar Giore sent a message from the land of Israel to Babylonia in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Although we have not found in the entire Torah that any verse distinguishes between sexual intercourse in a typical manner and sexual intercourse in an atypical manner, this is regular sex versus anal sex. So then with regard to flogging, like in the case of the defamer, or any other punishment, we have not found any distinction. If a man is guilty of rape for having regular sex with his victim, he's guilty of rape for having anal sex with her too. But in the case of the defamer, there seems to be a nuance. However, in the case of the defamer, the Torah does distinguish in this manner, as the husband is obligated to pay the fine of being a defamer only if he had intercourse with his wife, even if it was in an atypical manner, and he defames her by claiming that she had previously had intercourse in a typical manner with someone else. So he has to have had some kind of relations with her, even if it was in the atypical manner. But he's claiming that she became a non-virgin because she had sex in the typical manner with somebody else, committed adultery with someone else. Only if those elements are met would this defamation case move forward. So the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is this ruling of Rabbi Yochanan? If it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, as opposed to the normal case of, he had normal sex with her and discovered not a virgin and then accuses her of having had normal sex with someone else. But in addition to that, there's this one other possibility. So the Gemara, in accordance with whose is this opinion, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says we require both this and this, the active intercourse between the husband and wife, and that the woman's alleged active intercourse with another man to be performed in a typical manner. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov interprets the verses literally, meaning that the husband had intercourse with her and discovered she was not a virgin. Rather, Rav Kahana sent a word in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the statement was as follows: he is obligated to pay the fine only if he had intercourse in a typical manner and defamed her with regard to intercourse performed in a typical manner in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And after that clarification, that's the end of the discussion of Mishnah number 3. We're on 46b and moving on to Mishnah number 4. A father has authority. Now we're getting much more into marriage contracts, right, and who is responsible for somebody's upkeep. So we're getting much more specific about she passes from that her father's obligated to care for her to her husband is obligated to sustain her. A father has authority over his daughter with regard to her betrothal, right? A father can betroth his daughter to someone. And in what ways? Through money, right? He can receive a payment for the betrothal, or through a marriage document, the ketubah, or through intercourse, meaning if a young woman and a Jewish woman and a Jewish man have intercourse, then that is one of the ways of achieving betrothal. It's considered licentious, and he's actually flogged for proceeding that way, but they're now considered betrothed, and they could be considered married too. We'd study that elsewhere. The point is that a father would have the right to say, which father would do this, but a father would have the right to say to a prospective son-in-law, okay, you can become betrothed to my wife, to my daughter, and the method of betrothal, instead of having a contract or exchanging money as a contract, go ahead and have sex. Not something that would typically ever happen, but the father has the right to say you could proceed that way. Likewise, a father is entitled to the items that his daughter has found, right? Ownerless items that can't be returned to the owner. If she is a minor living in his house, right? It's like child labor earnings or found objects belong to the head of the household in which she lives. So likewise, a father is entitled to items she has found and to her earnings and to effect the nullification of her vows, i.e. a father may nullify his daughter's vows. And he accepts her bill of divorce on her behalf if she is divorced from betrothal before she becomes a grown woman. If she becomes a grown woman while she's betrothed, then she herself can only accept her bill of divorce. Her father can't do that for her. Although he inherits her property when she dies, for example, property she inherited from her mother's family, He does not consume the produce of her property during her lifetime. If the daughter married, the husband has more rights and obligations than her father had before the marriage, as he does consume the produce of her property during her lifetime, and he is obligated to provide her sustenance, her redemption if she is captured, and her burial upon her death. Rabbi Yehuda says even the poorest man of the Jewish people may not provide fewer than 2 flutes and a lamenting woman, which it was customary to hire for a funeral, as these 2 are included in the duties of burial. Now the Gemara on this Mishnah number 4. The Mishnah indicates that a father receives the money of his daughter's betrothal, and the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that the father's entitled to the money for her betrothal? And Rabbi Yehuda said that the verse states, with regard to an emancipated Hebrew maidservant, then she shall go out for nothing, without money, from which it is inferred there is no money for this master, i.e. her master does not receive money when she leaves him, but there is money for a different master, and who is this? Her father, who also had authority over her like her master. And when she leaves her father's jurisdiction via betrothal, he is entitled to the betrothal money. In other words, if it's a prominent family and a beautiful young girl, and there's a lot of, prospective husbands vying for the right to marry her, one of them might strike a deal with the father that the father's going to receive a lot of money in order to obtain his consent that this, wealthy son-in-law will marry the daughter. So the Gemara asks, but one can say that the betrothal money should go to her, as one can derive from the verse that there is no money for this master, but there is money for the woman herself when she leaves her father's domain. And the Gemara refutes this suggestion. Now consider, her father accepts her betrothal, i.e. he can accept the money or document of betrothal from the man of his choice, as it is written, I gave my daughter to this man. Can one then say, Deuteronomy 22:16, can one then say that she takes the money herself when her father accepts the betrothal on her behalf? Well, the Gemara raises a difficulty, but one can say this applies only to a minor who does not have a hand, i.e. she is not legally competent to carry out transactions on her own behalf. However, in the case of a young woman who does have a hand and she is competent to carry out transactions on her own behalf, so she should betroth herself, and she should also take her own betrothal money. The Gemara answers that there's a different exposition in this regard, as the verse states, being in her youth in her father's house, which teaches that all gains that a daughter accrues in her youth, meaning when she's a young woman, accrue to her father. So both the minor and the young woman, the betrothal price or her earnings go to the father. It's only when she's an emancipated, full-grown adult that her earnings go to her. And that happens when she's 12 and a half. So the Gemara asks, but consider that which Rav Huna said, that Rav said. From where is it derived that the earnings of a daughter belong to her father? It is as it is stated, and if a man sells his daughter to be a maidservant, just as with regard to a maidservant her earnings belong to her master, so too with regard to a daughter her earnings belong to her father. Why do I need this exposition? Let him derive it from the phrase, being in her youth, in her father's house. Rather, that phrase, being in her youth, in her father's house, is written with regard to another matter. And what is that? Nullification of vows, right? A woman, if a man vows a vow, right, and then he'd like to get out of it, his only option is to go find a rabbinic court or, a sage or a prophet who examines him and basically finds that, if you had known what the consequences of this vow would be when you vowed it, would you have vowed it? Oh, no, definitely not. And then the sage or the prophet can nullify those vows. If a woman vows a vow, she has this extra opportunity to have her vow nullified by her father if she lives in her father's house, or by her husband if she lives in her husband's house. And if they don't nullify it for her, then she's in the same position as any man who, in his emotion vowed a vow that he later regrets, and she'll have to go get it nullified by a sage or a prophet. So it's actually an advantage to her that her father or her husband can nullify her vows. And if you would say, let us derive from here that just as she is under her father's authority with regard to vows, the same applies to monetary matters. Well, this is not possible, because there is a principle that we do not derive monetary matters from ritual matters, as these are two separate areas of halakha, of law. And if you would say, let us derive this law from the fine paid by the rapist of a young woman, which the Torah explicitly states goes to her father, There is another principle that we do not derive monetary matters from fines, as we've seen. Each fine imposed by the Torah is a novel law from which nothing else can be learned with respect to other laws, especially about monetary liabilities. So if you would say, let us derive it from the compensation paid by the rapist for his victim's humiliation and degradation, which is a monetary matter and not a specific fine of the rapist, and these are also paid to the father, but the compensation for humiliation and degradation is different, as her father also has a share in it because he too is humiliated and harmed by this unfortunate episode, and therefore one cannot learn the laws of other monetary matters from those cases. So rather, the Gemara returns to the previous exposition of the verse, then she shall go out for nothing without money, which is if somebody buys a young woman to be his slave, intending to marry her, and then he decides he doesn't want to marry her, he has to release her for free. She doesn't have to pay for her freedom, even though he paid for her to be his slave. She shall go out for nothing, without money. As for the question of why she does not receive the money herself, the Gemara explains that it is reasonable to assume that when the merciful one excludes a case by means of this verse, he excludes a case where the girl leaves someone's authority in the corresponding situation to the case of the Hebrew maidservant, which is like a daughter going to betrothal. So the Gemara raises a difficulty, but this leaving of her father's authority is not comparable to that of leaving her master's authority when she was purchased as a slave. There, with regard to a master, when he frees her, she leaves his authority entirely. Whereas in the case of a girl who goes out from the jurisdiction of her father because she's betrothed, she still lacks the process of being brought to the wedding canopy. She hasn't left her father's authority. Her father can sort of give away his daughter to be betrothed, but she's still living in his house. He could still nullify her vows, okay, in conjunction with the new husband. It takes both of them to do it, but she has definitely not left the father's authority the way she would have if the father sold her to a new master as a maidservant, as a female slave. How can you compare these two areas of law? They're different. So the Gemara answers, from the perspective of her father's right to effect the nullification of her vows, at least, she has left his domain via betrothal, as he no longer maintains the exclusive right to nullify her vows. As we learned in the Mishna, Nadarim 66b, with regard to a betrothed young woman, her father and her husband nullify her vows together. Since her father cannot nullify her vows on his own, the two types of leaving are indeed comparable. But you would say, what are you talking about? When she leaves her father's house to be purchased by a new master, he has no authority over her. When she's betrothed, he shares authority. How can you say that those are comparable? They're not. The Mishnah taught that a father is entitled to accept betrothal of his daughter through a marriage document or through intercourse. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? The Gemara answers that the verse states, and she becomes another man's wife. Since the verse does not specify how she becomes his wife, the different ways of becoming a wife are compared to each other, i.e. they're considered equal in this context, and accordingly the various methods of betrothal are the same with regard to the authority of the father. The father can consent that she should become betrothed to some man because he pays a dowry price, or because he wrote a marriage contract, or because he had intercourse with this woman, and then they became betrothed, and the father can agree to that. He has the right to agree to that, although what father would? So the Mishnah further taught that a father is entitled to items that she has found while living in his house. Now we're on page 47a. The Gemara explains the reason is due to enmity, so that he should not bear a grudge against her for finding articles and withholding them from him, which might lead him to become reluctant to provide her with sustenance. The Mishnah further taught that a father is entitled to his daughter's earnings, right? If it's like hiring out the child for labor, because, she's under his authority, he would receive the earnings from the employer. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? And the Gemara answers, as Rav Huna said that Rav said, from where is it derived that the earnings of a daughter belong to her father? Again, this is a minor or a young woman. Once she's 12 and a half, she's an adult and she gets her own wages. And this is because he's responsible for her sustenance while living in his house. As Rav Huna said that Rav said, from where is this derived? As it is stated, Exodus 21:7, and if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, which indicates that just as with regard to a maidservant, her earnings belong to her master, as she was sold for this purpose, so too with regard to a daughter, her earnings go to her father. And the Gemara asks, but one can say that this applies only to a minor, as a father can sell her as a maidservant. However, with regard to a young woman, whom he cannot sell, perhaps her earnings should belong to her. He can only sell her while she's a minor. He can't sell her while she's a young woman. So the Gemara responds, it is reasonable that her earnings should go to her father, as if it should enter your mind to say that her earnings do not belong to her father. What about the fact that the merciful one entitles a father to bring his daughter, when she is a young woman, to the wedding canopy? How can he bring her to the wedding canopy? Doesn't he thereby cause her to neglect her earnings at that time, as she cannot work while getting married? If she has the rights to her own earnings, she can object on these grounds. Very interesting argument, right? Once she's 12 and a half, the father cannot compel her to marry some guy, right? He can only compel her to marry or betroth, let's say, when she's a minor, or marry when she's a young woman, but not after she's a full-grown woman. So if he can't compel her to marry, how is it that he's entitled to her earnings? Or vice versa, if he's entitled to her earnings, if she's entitled to her earnings, how can he compel her to get married? If, when she's entitled to her earnings, you can't force her to do anything because you're taking her away from work that she could do for her own self. Interesting argument. Where am I? Okay, so Rav Achai refutes this claim. Say that when he brings her to the wedding canopy, the father brings his daughter to the wedding canopy to marry her new husband. He gives her the wages that she neglects by taking a break from her work, and therefore the above objection does not apply. Or it is referring to a case where he brought her to the wedding canopy at night when she does not work. Or it means that he brought her to the wedding canopy on Shabbos or festivals when it is prohibited to work. It's also prohibited to get married. Rather, the Gemara reverts to the original exposition based upon the case of a Hebrew maidservant and argues that with regard to a minor, it is not necessary to derive from a verse that her father is entitled to her earnings for the following reason. Now, if the father has the right to sell her as a maidservant, is it necessary to state that her earnings belong to him? Rather, when the verse was necessary, it was to teach that the earnings of a young woman also belong to her father, even though he cannot sell her at that stage. The Mishna taught that a father is entitled to effect the nullification of his daughter's vows. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? And the Gemara answers, that is written, being in her youth, in her father's house, Numbers 30:17. And the Torah then proceeds to explain that during this period, a father can nullify his daughter's vows. And the Mishna further taught, and he accepts her bill of divorce on her behalf. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? The Gemara answers that it is written, and she departs out of his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. So the verse juxtaposes departing a marriage and becoming a wife, which teaches the laws of betrothal apply to her, departing her husband's home via a bill of divorce. Consequently, just as a father has the right to accept betrothal on his daughter's behalf, he can also receive a bill of divorce on her behalf if she is a minor or a young woman, but not if she's an adult. The Mishnah taught that a father may not consume the produce of his daughter's property during her lifetime. A husband can do that, a father cannot. This is property that somehow is hers, but was never her father's. Meaning she inherited something from her mother that came from the mother's family, and then it was bequeathed to her daughter, and it was never owned by the mother's husband, never owned by her father. So the Mishnah taught that the father may not consume the produce of his daughter's property during her lifetime. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, father may not consume the produce of his daughter's property during his daughter's lifetime. Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says a father may consume this produce during his daughter's lifetime. The Gemara asks, with regard to what principle do the Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda disagree? The Gemara asks, with regard to what do they disagree? And the Gemara explains that the first Tana holds, granted in the case of a husband, the sages decreed for him that he should consume her produce, as if this were not so, he would refrain from redeeming her if she were captured. The right of a husband to consume the produce of his wife's property was instituted in order to correspond to his obligation to redeem his wife from captivity. And now, without making a lot of fanfare, we have transitioned into talking about what are the rights and obligations of spouses in a marriage, right? So one of those rights that a husband has with respect to his wife is that if she brings property into the marriage, eventually, if they divorce, she'll take that property out of the marriage with her. But let's say it's a farm field, and while they're married, it's a productive field, right, that produces crops. So the husband can benefit from those crops. She'll retain the field, and if they get divorced, she leaves the marriage with the field that she brought into the marriage, but he can consume the produce of the field while they're married. Why? Because this offsets his obligation that if she is captured, that he must redeem her, right? He must pay the ransom to redeem the captive. Redeemer, if she's captured, the right of a husband to consume the produce was instituted in order to correspond to his obligation to redeem his wife from captivity. However, in the case of a father, what is there to say? That he will refrain from redeeming her? Even without this right to the produce of her property, he will redeem his daughter, as he will certainly not turn a blind eye to his own flesh and blood. And Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, holds, if he is deprived of the right to the produce of his daughter's property, a father will also refrain from redeeming her, as he will reason, a pouch of money is held in her land for a time of need, so let her go and redeem herself. What father would ever say that? The Mishna further taught that if the daughter married, the husband has more rights than her father, as he consumes the produce of her property. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, if the father wrote for her in her marriage contract that he was providing produce, clothing, and vessels that would come with her as a dowry from her father's house to her husband's house, and she died during the betrothal period, the husband does not have a right to these objects. And they said in the name of Rabbi Nassan, the husband does have a right to these objects. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that the dispute of these rabbis is parallel to the dispute between Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah and the rabbis who disagree with him. As we learned in the Mishnah on page 54, we're on 47 now, so we'll encounter this next week. If a woman was widowed or divorced, whether from marriage or from betrothal, she collects the entire sum specified in her marriage contract, including any extra amount that her husband added to the standard sum required by the sages, right? Maybe in order to marry this beautiful woman from a prominent family, he had to add to the minimum amount required in the ketubah. So Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah says if she was widowed or divorced from marriage, she collects the entire amount. But if she was widowed or divorced from betrothal, she's entitled to collect only the standard minimum sum required by the sages. If she was betrothed as a virgin, she collects 200 dinars. And if she was a widow, she's entitled to 100 dinars. Now in 47b. The reason is that he wrote that she would be entitled to the additional amount only on condition that he would marry her. And since he did not marry her, she's not entitled to the extra amount. So the Gemara compares the respective opinions. The one who says that the husband does not have the right to her dowry holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and therefore he rules that just as a husband guarantees his wife an extra sum in her marriage contract only if they actually get married, the wife's father also gives the dowry only on condition that the couple actually marries. They move from betrothal to marriage. And the one who said that the husband does have the right to her dowry holds in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis because the document is fully in effect even before marriage. I'm almost done. Got questions or comments? Get them in. But isn't that interesting? A law that would seem to protect her more than the husband. In the flip side, right? You know, in terms of property she brings into the marriage, you always have to be careful when you're making a ruling that sounds equitable, because there will be another situation where this equitable ruling will set a precedent that will seem inequitable in that other context. Right? The law of unintended consequences also sometimes, described as tough cases make bad law. The Gemara refutes the suggestion. No, everyone agrees that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and the explanation is like this. The one who said that he does not have the right to the dowry clearly holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, as stated above. And the one who says the husband does have a right to her dowry would distinguish between the two cases. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah states that the marriage contract is not fully in effect until marriage, only with regard to a bestowal from him to her, the extra sum that he promised in order to marry her, as he wrote it for her only on the condition that he would marry her, and then he never did marry her, so she's only entitled to the original marriage contract, not this extra amount. But with regard to her own property that she brings into the marriage, if they became betrothed, does he get that or does he not get that? Right? One opinion is that she leaves the betrothal with the property she brought into the betrothal, and the other is it was a dowry, and once the betrothal is like a marriage, and he would get to keep it. However, with regard However, with regard to that which is given from her father to him, i.e. the dowry, even Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah concedes that the husband is entitled to this money as the gift of a father is due to the marriage, i.e. he wants the families to be joined in matrimony, and they have already become linked in marriage once there's a betrothal. So the dowry given by the father has nothing to do with the transition from betrothal to actual marriage. And that's where we're going to knock off for today. But as you can see, we've actually started to get into the law of rights and responsibilities within the marriage, and this sort of transfer of property, transfer of authority as the young bride leaves her father's house and enters her husband's house. All right, let's see if we have questions or comments. Yep. And we managed to do enough. So we did 2 pages today, even with the hiccup at the beginning. Tomorrow we'll pick it up when we're doing page 48. We're a few paragraphs away from the end of 47b, but close enough. All right. Questions on pages 46 and 47. Nina's saying not many comments for some reason. Okay. Sharon. Okay, I will try again. The book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, Eshes Hail, right, that we read on Friday nights, the woman of valor. Eshes Hail portrays a woman who is proficient in business as well as in the home. How does this square with this portrayal of women as dependent in personal finances? But what I would say is, first of all, right, it was a world where a woman kind of living alone was considered too vulnerable and too unprotected. But of course, a woman could be super bright, super talented in various areas of making money or even administering estates, right? And then, but this is a praise. That proverb that you're speaking of is a husband praising his wife for being so adept at running a business and doing all these things and running the household and even running a business. But it's the context of the husband praising her for that, right? So it's, in other words, she brings all this value into their joint home, as it were. And it's, it just wasn't contemplated in that world. Of course it happened. Of course there were exceptions. Of course there were widows, who had ample means, did not choose to remarry, and were wealthy businesswomen, running even business empires. It just wasn't the norm. But I think, and we've seen in a bunch of places that even in this highly patriarchal system, and the Talmud itself, a highly male-oriented place where there's really no female sages, and yet from time to time we hear about women not only running businesses themselves, but very adept in Torah study, Torah discourse, understanding the law, even understanding the law better than the sages themselves, right? And we hear stories like that about Bruria and Ima Shalom and a few other, famous women in the Talmud. Sadly, they're vastly outnumbered by these male sages. So, we're just talking about what was normal and what was unusual. But within that context, and what was revolutionary at the time, is taking such meticulous care of the woman's, rights and who's going to sustain her and how they're going to sustain her and what she's entitled to, etc. Because probably in the rest of the world, they were like, whatever, your dad will take care of you, your husband will take care of you, and there wouldn't be a whole system of law codified that she could bring a claim to court. There, she could bring the claim herself and say, under the law, I am entitled to, in such an extensive body of law of what she's entitled to monetarily, in terms of self-authority, in terms of all kinds of things. That's what we've got for today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, hopefully moving at a regular pace for Daf Mem Ches, right, page 40.